Brace yourself.
Fear is one of humanity's most visceral of emotions. It's the feeling of being threatened, where our comfort is taken away and the dangers of the world around us become all the more real to us. It's odd that a feeling with such a negative connotation is also one that's studied so thoroughly. We like to study fear. We want to understand how it works, even though it provides stimuli that are very discomforting to us. There are many ways to make fear work, and just as many to make it fail. But I'm going to look at one example that I think does the deed correctly, and provides us with a sense of fear that's exactly how it should be. Difficult to decipher. That's F.E.A.R. First Encounter Assault Recon by Monolith Productions. I'll openly admit that F.E.A.R. isn't really a horror game. At its core, it's clearly an action-heavy shooter, so this video isn't going to be an argument of why it's a great horror game. Instead, I want to analyze individual moments in F.E.A.R. that demonstrate some excellent methods of producing horror, tactics that I believe any amazing horror game designer would be foolish to overlook. This is where F.E.A.R. truly succeeds when it comes to producing, well, fear. As I've said before, fear is the human species' defense against the lack of logic. Logic is our defining human element, so when we're put in a position where we don't understand something, we're naturally driven to fear it. There are dozens of different techniques that horror genre connoisseurs have practiced over the years, regardless of the medium in effect. But they share the commonality of putting the audience in a mentally off-kilter state, where we can't entirely understand something and can't use logic as a method of producing power to survive. The primary method that F.E.A.R. uses to create fear is one that any successful horror media should use, bar none. An emphasis on the subtle. This ability to restrain the gruesome or frightening vision is what sets a horror story apart from a thriller or slasher. While your typical slasher flick is one of blatant gore and borderline nauseating violence, a horror film can't use that level of explicitness to divert the person's logic. This is why jump scares in the indie sphere of games don't equate to horror, because the result is simply a biological reaction of the body and not a psychological reaction of the mind. Jumping at a surprise in Five Nights at Freddy's isn't horror, it's simply your nerves acting as they should. This is the same with a slasher movie because the gore is so in your face. While it's definitely gruesome, you fully understand that it's gruesome. You're still in command of the logic, as off-putting as it might be. A piece of media that makes that threat more nebulous and difficult to decipher is the one that will get the best result. The audience is forced to try and piece things together, but if done correctly, ultimately is left at a loss. At the same time, a sudden jerk in perspective or very brief events of unusual occurrences comfortably sit at where horror lies. They aren't drawn out enough to give players the time to think and analyze the situation, but they aren't instantaneous enough that the player can't realize their disturbing nature until long after the biological reactions of the nerves kick in. The character Alma is where a majority of F.E.A.R.'s subtle horror elements lie. Beyond her diminutive appearance stands a versatile tool in creating fear and never letting the player regain their mental balance. It isn't revealed until later in the game who Alma is or her connection with the villain Paxton Fettel, but her appearances pepper the early portions of the campaign. Aside from an aesthetic design straight out of Japanese horror cinema, Alma's sporadic motion and appearances are masterful examples of nailing that golden mean of horror. Normally, a player will receive an unusual transmission on the communicator from an unknown entity, signifying that the action will be set aside for an atmospheric scare. Alma's appearances range from the instantaneous to the eerily implied, but they never reach full-on explicit. Hallucination sequences are so drastically different in aesthetic from the rest of F.E.A.R., so the player instantly has the rug whipped from under them, only to have them vanish quickly afterward. It's when Alma actually makes appearances that you realize Monolith's mastery of the subtle elements of horror. Her appearances are so fast and almost easy to miss that you often wonder if they even happened at all. A quick scurry between boxes or her shadow on a wall are extremely quick, but force the player to question the validity of their own senses. I personally found her appearance behind the player when mounting a ladder early in the game to be much less of a jump scare and more of an ingenious cinematography technique, especially considering that this situation was during a ladder movement animation out of the player's control before vanishing immediately, and that Alma never posed a threat to the player. I was really able to bask in my own disorientation without worrying about her as a threat. These moments of immediate, easy-to-miss sequences hit the mark when it comes to giving the player no explicit indication of an event, but a fast and mentally dizzying pace to prevent logic from digging in. Alma herself remains a cornerstone of nearly every memorable horror moment in F.E.A.R, though I will give some nice cinematography scenes with F.E.A.R to have some occasional substantiality as well. Every great moment with Alma is based on implication, and not once do her appearances feel 100% real within the scope of the game world. The way Alma is implemented into these moments is intentionally easy to miss and difficult to process, questioning our own sight and making us feel, just for a moment, that we can't even trust our own perception of the world around us. We feel alien behind our own eyes, and that level of disorientation makes F.E.A.R extremely easy to develop. Any game that makes the player question their own senses has at least some grasp on creating fear, and Alma's constant presence is claustrophobic to the mind, a perfect figure for horror to grow. As a shooter, F.E.A.R is quite incredible. A honed campaign of sensory stimulus is marvelous. But even as that adrenaline-pumping action clashes viciously with its horror themes, the way Monolith crafted the horror set pieces in F.E.A.R is even more incredible. F.E.A.R is a game where your most internal senses are put into question, and when something that close to you becomes difficult to trust, you can't help but feel scared of what exactly is going on. Subtlety keeps these events nebulous and implicit, forcing the player to process the infinite spirals of what-ifs around the game world. And as the spiral moves outward, the player's realization of how little they know becomes the horror designer's advantage. I still stand by my claim that F.E.A.R really isn't a horror game, but I'd be lying if I said that it didn't feature set pieces that are prime examples of horror at work. For a game that's so focused on action, the examples of subtlety and restraint that Monolith have put into F.E.A.R are astonishing, rarely giving the player the resources needed to feel like they're in control. It's how F.E.A.R thrives, taking advantage of those pitfalls in logic and dragging the player down further. I'd like to thank you all for watching, and have a happy Halloween. Hey everybody, thank you for watching my video on F.E.A.R First Encounter Assault Recon. If you enjoyed it, remember to like, favorite, comment, subscribe, and share. Any feedback and spreading of the word is very much appreciated. If you want to see my last video on Until Dawn, you can check out the link right there, and there's also a link to the Let's Play channel that I do with my friend Matt. It is What the Fuck Game, where we do Let's Plays of different PC and console games, along with social media information at the bottom. Thanks again for watching, folks, and have a good one.